She arrived just as the sun was dipping behind the tall city buildings, sending long shadows across the polished streets. The evening air was crisp, carrying a faint scent of winter flowers from a nearby park. In her hand, she clutched the worn sheet music she had been practicing for weeks. It wasn't fancy, nor did it have golden notes or intricate markings. It was simple, like her, yet it carried all the effort, all the late nights, and all the hope she had built over the years. She paused for a moment outside the grand building, taking in the enormous glass doors, the shining marble steps, and the quiet hum of expensive cars pulling up. The place looked intimidating, almost untouchable, like a world she had only seen in magazines. She felt a flutter of nerves, a whisper of doubt, but she pushed it away. This was a chance, maybe the only chance, to show what she could do. The doorman, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, nodded politely as she handed him her invitation. He didn't say anything about her clothes, about the simple coat she had stitched herself, or the shoes that had seen better days. He just let her in, and she stepped into a world that felt entirely different from her own. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, scattering light like little stars across the room. The walls were lined with portraits of people who looked important, powerful, and, to her, a little untouchable. She walked carefully, feeling the smooth marble beneath her feet, trying not to stumble over her own nerves. Every step made her heart beat a little faster. The hall was vast, filled with soft velvet chairs and gleaming tables, some holding glasses of sparkling water, some untouched. She could hear murmurs from the audience, soft laughter, and the clinking of glasses. The room was alive in a quiet, measured way, each person seeming to carry a weight of expectation and status. She found the piano at the center, a grand instrument that gleamed under the lights, polished to a shine that almost hurt her eyes. She ran her hand over it lightly, feeling the cool smoothness of the keys beneath her fingers. It was the same piano she had practiced on in a much smaller room. But here it felt larger, almost like it had its own personality. Waiting to respond to her touch, as she took her seat, she noticed the audience more closely. They were dressed impeccably, each person carrying the air of someone who had everything they could ever want. Expensive watches, sparkling jewelry, and perfectly tailored suits. Some whispered to each other, barely looking at her, others glanced with mild curiosity, and a few seemed completely absorbed in whatever conversation they were having. There was a sense of quiet judgment in the room, a subtle measuring of her before she even played a single note. She could feel eyes on her, some filled with doubt, some with mild amusement. They expected nothing remarkable. Some had seen countless performers in this hall before, and she was just another name on the list, a momentary diversion. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She remembered why she had agreed to play here in the first place. Not for money, not for recognition, not for applause. She was here because music had always been her voice when words failed her. She had grown up with melodies as her closest friends, a piano that had been her confidant during lonely nights, and songs that carried her through struggles she couldn't yet name. She let her eyes drift over the audience once more, not with fear, but with a quiet determination. These people, as intimidating as they seemed, were just humans, with hearts that could be reached. She had learned over the years that music had a way of touching even the most guarded hearts. Her hands hovered above the keys. She could feel the tension in her fingers, the nervous energy that always came before a performance. But she also felt something else, a sense of calm, a steady confidence that had grown from years of dedication. She had practiced this song countless times in the small hours of the morning, fingers aching, eyes strained from reading notes in dim light. Every mistake, every correction, every tear shed over a difficult passage had led to this moment. She could almost feel the song waiting inside her, ready to emerge, ready to speak without words. Around her, the audience continued with their quiet conversations, completely unaware of the storm of emotion she was carrying within her. A man in the front row sipped his wine with a faint look of impatience. A woman nearby adjusted her bracelet, barely glancing at the piano. A few people in the back smiled at each other, perhaps sharing memories of music they had once loved but had long forgotten. They did not yet know that the song she was about to play would stop them in their tracks. that it would reach beyond the surface and touch something deep and human. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, remembering the first time she had played this song in a small, empty room. She remembered how the notes had felt like pieces of her soul, how the melody had made her cry, how it had lifted her even when nothing else could. That memory gave her courage. She reminded herself that she didn't need to impress anyone, didn't need to prove anything to the wealthy audience that surrounded her. Her task was simple, to play from her heart and let the music do the speaking. As she opened her eyes and looked at the keys again, she noticed a shift in the room. The whispers grew quieter. A few people straightened in their chairs, curious now, sensing that something different was about to happen. Some glanced toward the piano with genuine interest, though they would not admit it out loud. She could feel the collective attention slowly turning toward her, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. She adjusted her posture, taking care to sit straight, not stiff, not casual, but ready. Then came a moment of silence, brief but complete. The audience had noticed that she was ready to begin. There was no fanfare, no announcement, just the quiet understanding that the performance was about to start. She felt her heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from anticipation. She positioned her fingers over the keys and paused, feeling the weight of that small, powerful moment. Time seemed to stretch. The air in the room felt heavier, more alive, as if it were waiting with her. Finally, she pressed the first key, a soft note that barely echoed in the grand hall. And yet even that tiny sound seemed to change the atmosphere. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-word. Eyes focused. She smiled faintly to herself, knowing that she had begun. The song, simple and honest, began to flow from her fingers. Every note carried a piece of her story, her struggles, her hopes, her quiet strength. She didn't rush. She let the melody breathe, letting it unfold naturally, like a conversation that had waited years to happen. Around her, the audience was slowly becoming aware that this performance was unlike anything they expected. The notes weren't flashy or showy. There were no dramatic flourishes meant to impress, but there was honesty, clarity, and emotion that could not be ignored. Some people leaned forward slightly, drawn in without knowing why. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Even the most distracted in the room began to pay attention, pulled in by a story that was being told purely through sound. She noticed small changes as she played. A hand stopped fiddling with a bracelet. A sip of wine paused mid-motion. A few faces softened, lines of stress and skepticism replaced with quiet attention. She continued, feeling the music speak directly to them, bypassing any walls they had built with wealth or status. It was as if the room itself had shifted, bending toward the sound, acknowledging the presence of something real and human. Her fingers moved effortlessly now, guided by memory and feeling. She had practiced this song so many times, yet each performance was new, alive, because it carried the energy of the moment, the presence of the people listening, and the weight of her own heart. The grand hall, filled with glittering lights and opulent surroundings, seemed to shrink. It no longer mattered how expensive the room was, or how powerful the audience seemed. All that mattered was the connection forming, note by note, between her and each person present. Time became almost irrelevant. She played, and the story of the music unfolded naturally. She could feel it in the subtle shifts in the room, the quiet breath she could sense from some audience members, the tiny movements of recognition in others. She had entered a space where her music mattered more than anything else, and in that space, she felt free, confident, and alive. By the time she finished the first segment of the song, a hush had settled over the room. No one moved, no one spoke. The sound of her last note lingered in the air, a delicate echo that seemed to hold everyone's attention, almost demanding that it be felt. She didn't rush to the next part. She simply allowed the silence to exist, letting the audience absorb what they had just heard, letting the emotions settle. She knew this moment was crucial. It was the bridge between expectation and surprise, between polite curiosity and genuine attention. She breathed slowly, keeping her hands poised above the keys. There was a sense of anticipation building in the room, though not everyone realized it yet. The music had begun to tell its story, and the audience, wealthy and powerful as they were, could not ignore it. They were no longer in control of the experience. She was guiding them, note by note, through emotions they had perhaps not allowed themselves to feel in years. She smiled faintly, not out of arrogance, but because she knew she was doing what she had always been meant to do. The first part of her performance, simple yet full of heart, had set the tone. The rich audience, initially poised and detached, was now paying attention, even if they didn't fully understand why. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not in showing off skill, but in creating connection. And as she prepared for the next section of the song, she realized that the evening, the room, and the audience were now a part of her story. Just as much as she was a part of theirs, the room had grown quieter than she had ever imagined possible. The soft hum of the chandeliers above seemed to blend with the lingering notes of her first section, creating a fragile stillness that made her heart beat even faster. She glanced at the audience, noticing now that they were no longer merely looking at her. They were seeing her. The woman with the diamond bracelet had stopped fiddling. The man in the front row had set his glass down without even noticing, and several others had tilted their heads slightly, like they were leaning into a story that was just beginning. She felt a flicker of something she had rarely felt before. Validation, not for skill, not for recognition, but for being truly heard. Yet beneath that warmth, doubt still lingered in a small corner of her mind. Even as the room seemed to pause, there was that tiny voice whispering, "What if this is just a fluke? What if they don't care after a few minutes? What if they leave disappointed?" She shook it away gently. She had learned over the years that fear was always a companion to courage, and the trick was not to let it control you. She took a slow, steady breath and allowed her fingers to rest lightly on the keys, feeling the smoothness under her fingertips. Each key was familiar, yet in this grand hall, every note felt amplified, almost alive. She began the next part of the song, letting the melody deepen, allowing the music to breathe and stretch. It was a more complicated section, one that required both precision and emotion. Her fingers moved gracefully, guided by instinct and hours of practice. She didn't rush. Each note was deliberate, carrying its own weight, its own story. She could feel the tension in the room shift, growing heavier, but not unpleasantly so. The audience seemed to lean into her performance, though none would admit it aloud. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others fixed their gaze on her hands, as if trying to understand the secret behind the music in the back. She noticed a man who had been glancing around the room, clearly impatient at first. He now sat rigidly, shoulders straight, his lips pressed together, absorbing every sound. The change was subtle, but it made her heart lift. She realized that music had this strange, quiet power. It could touch someone without them even knowing it, reaching through walls of pride, skepticism, and habit. She had seen it happen before in small rooms, in community halls, in empty cafes, but never in a room this grand. Never with an audience so composed, so polished, and so seemingly unreachable. Her mind wandered briefly to the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the hours spent practicing on a rickety piano in a cramped apartment, fingers aching, eyes burning from studying every note. She remembered moments of doubt, nights when she questioned whether anyone would ever care, whether anyone would ever listen. And yet, here she was, standing in a room full of people who had the world at their fingertips, and she had their attention. She let a small smile touch her lips, not for pride, but for gratitude. Music had carried her here, and it was doing its work once again. The melody swelled gently, and she allowed herself to feel it fully. This part of the song was meant to evoke something raw, something almost fragile, a whisper of emotion that spoke directly to the heart. She could see reactions forming, a subtle shift in posture, quick intake of breath, a tear almost visible at the corner of someone's eye. The room had transformed. It was no longer just a gathering of wealthy people. It was a shared space of emotion, fragile and real. She felt connected to each individual, as if the music had built invisible bridges between her and the audience. Her own emotions began to surface. She hadn't expected this to be so powerful, so immediate. She felt a lump in her throat, a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in a long while, she let herself be present in the moment, allowing vulnerability to seep into the music. She didn't need to hide behind perfection. The song was perfect in its honesty. She let the keys guide her, trusting that each note would find its way to the listeners. And it did. The silence in the room was deep, almost tangible, as the audience became fully immersed. She could feel their breathing slowing, their movements halting. A few had their hands clasped, resting on their laps, as if they were holding on to the music itself. Others had tilted their heads, leaning forward slightly, eyes closed, allowing themselves to be carried by something beyond themselves. She had always known music had power, but experiencing it here, in this room, with people so distant and seemingly untouchable, was something different altogether, she continued, letting the song rise and fall like the ebb and flow of the sea. There was no rush, no performance for attention. Each note was meant to be felt, each pause carefully measured to allow emotion to resonate. She noticed a few people exchanging glances, silently communicating something they could not say aloud. She could almost read their thoughts. Surprise, recognition, awe, even a quiet admiration. It wasn't about money, about status, or about showing off skill. It was about honesty, about truth, about something deeply human that could not be ignored. Time seemed to blur. She played for what felt like hours, though it was only minutes. The room held its breath, suspended in the fragile world she had created. Even those who were typically impatient, who had come expecting polite entertainment, were now captive, willing participants in a shared, unspoken understanding. She felt the weight of that realization, a mixture of humility and quiet pride. She was not performing for accolades or applause. She was performing because it was the only way she could express what she carried inside. And the audience, despite their wealth and composure, was responding to it in the most human way possible, with silence, attention, and openness. Her thoughts drifted for a moment to the people she had left behind, friends, mentors, and even strangers who had encouraged her, who had believed in her even when she had doubted herself. They were all part of this journey, woven into the music she played, each note carrying fragments of their support, their belief, and their faith. She felt a quiet gratitude for them, knowing that without their presence in her life, this moment would not have been possible. Music, she realized, was never just her own. It was a collective experience, thread connecting lives in ways words could never achieve. The melody softened, now becoming gentler, more introspective. She let her fingers linger over the keys, drawing out each note, allowing it to resonate fully. The room was completely still, the audience captivated, yet no one dared to break the spell. She felt a connection she had never felt before, a fragile understanding that transcended class, status, and wealth. They were no longer simply observers. They were participants, emotionally entwined with the story she told through her music. She noticed small details the way a man's hand twitched slightly as he tried to resist emotion, the slight nod of a woman who had closed her eyes, letting the music reach a place she rarely allowed herself to go. These tiny, almost imperceptible reactions filled her with a quiet satisfaction. She realized that the power of music was not in flashy displays or technical brilliance, but in the ability to touch a heart, to remind someone of something real, something they may have forgotten or overlooked. That was what she aimed to do, and now she could see it happening. Her fingers moved effortlessly now, guided by instinct and emotion rather than thought. She was lost in the music, fully present, letting it flow through her as naturally as breathing. Each note was a message, a story, a whisper of vulnerability that she offered freely. And the audience received it, without pretense, without judgment. They were frozen, not by all alone, but by recognition of something universal, something human, something that no amount of wealth or power could ever suppress. As the song moved toward a subtle crescendo, she allowed herself to feel the enormity of the moment. She was not just performing. She was sharing a piece of herself, and it was being met with pure attention. The audience had shifted completely. Gone were the whispers, the subtle glances, the polite disinterest. In their place was silence, stillness, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the truth she conveyed through music. The room had transformed from a place of wealth and status into a sanctuary of emotion, a shared space of honesty and connection. The crescendo passed, and she let the music soften again, almost to a whisper. She could feel the weight of anticipation building in the audience, a tension born not from expectation, but from engagement. They were waiting, holding their breath, ready to be moved again, to be carried further into the story. She felt a smile tug at her lips, quietly pleased with the effect, though she remained focused entirely on the music. She didn't need applause or recognition. She only needed the truth of the moment, the honesty of the notes she played, and the connection that had formed between her and those listening. The song continued, flowing seamlessly from one emotion to another. She noticed that some audience members were leaning forward now, almost unconsciously, drawn into the story. Others had their eyes closed, perhaps remembering their own struggles, their own joys, their own losses. She could sense that the music was reaching deeper than mere entertainment, touching something essential and real. She played not for them, not for anyone, but herself. Yet in doing so, she had found a way to speak to them in the most profound way possible. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Every note, every pause, every breath carried weight and meaning. She could feel the energy in the room, the collective emotion of the audience, and it fueled her playing. She had never felt such an intense, tangible connection with a crowd before, and it left her both exhilarated and humbled. The rich, poised people in front of her were no longer distant or untouchable. They were human, experiencing emotion in its rawest form. And she was the conduit. As the final notes of this section approached, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She had arrived here uncertain, nervous, unsure if she belonged. Yet now, in this moment, she realized that belonging was not about wealth, status, or appearances. It was about presence, honesty, and courage, the courage to show up, to play, and to let music speak when words could not. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that she had created a space where emotion could be felt freely, where hearts could be touched in a way that transcended superficial boundaries. And then, as her fingers lingered on the last note, the room held its breath. Silence stretched, delicate and profound, as if the air itself were waiting to see what would happen next. She felt a small shiver run down her spine, not from fear, but from the power of the moment. She had reached them. Not just entertained them, not just impressed them, but truly reached them. And in that quiet, suspended space, she knew that the evening was far from over. The story was still unfolding. The best part, the part that would leave a mark, was yet to come. The room seemed suspended in a delicate balance, like the calm before a storm, yet softer, almost peaceful. She could feel the attention of the audience like a weight pressing gently on her shoulders. But instead of fear, it filled her with energy. Every person in the room, wealthy and powerful as they were, seemed caught in a moment that was bigger than them, bigger than appearances or status. They were waiting. They were listening. And she knew that what came next had to be more than just music hit, had to be a story, a truth they could feel in the heart. Even if they had never experienced it before, she closed her eyes briefly, taking in a slow, deliberate breath. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she was about to do. She had learned over the years that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength. The more she allowed herself to feel, the more the music could reach others. And this audience, so polished and distant at first, was ready even if they didn't know it yet. To feel something real, her fingers touched the keys again, this time with intention and certainty. The song shifted subtly, evolving from the gentle, intimate passages of the first two sections into something richer, deeper. The notes carried weight, a resonance that demanded attention without shouting for it. She let her emotions flow freely, not hiding the tremor in her hands or the quiver in her chest. The audience noticed, even if unconsciously, something human was happening here, something that could not be rehearsed or manufactured. She was telling a story, and they were listening, held captive by the honesty of it. Some of the audience members leaned forward slightly, curiosity etched on their faces. Others closed their eyes, letting the music carry them somewhere they hadn't been in years. She could sense shifts in posture, in breathing, in subtle expressions that betrayed the impact of the music. A few people tugged at their collars, straightened their jackets, or pressed their lips together as though trying to contain emotions they hadn't expected to feel. She played on, knowing that these small, almost imperceptible reactions were far more powerful than applause or praise. She remembered the countless nights she had spent alone at her piano, learning to pour everything she had into a single song. Nights when the room was dark and silent, except for the soft click of her keys and the echo of her own breathing. Times when frustration had threatened to overwhelm her, when fingers refused to cooperate, and yet she persisted. Every one of those nights had led to this moment, a moment in which her music was no longer just sound, but a bridge to hearts she never thought she could reach. The song began to swell, the melody climbing like a slow sunrise. She let her fingers glide across the keys, not hurrying, not forcing, simply letting the music guide her. She felt the room change. The chandeliers, the velvet chairs, the polished floors, they all seemed to fade away, leaving only the connection between her and the people listening. It was no longer about wealth, or status, or appearances. It was about human beings, about shared experience, about emotion made tangible through music. She felt a thrill at the realization that what she was doing could touch even the most guarded hearts in the back of the room. A man she had noticed in the first section now sat completely still, eyes fixed on her hands. There was a tension in his jaw, a focus in his gaze that spoke of someone struggling to contain unexpected feelings. A woman near the front, who had seemed indifferent at first, had closed her eyes. Her head tilted slightly as if she were remembering a memory she had long buried. Across the room, whispers had ceased entirely. The audience had stopped being just spectators. They had become participants in something fragile and profound. She let her thoughts drift briefly, letting them flow with the music. She thought about the people she had grown up with, the mentors who had believed in her, the strangers who had offered encouragement in moments she felt like giving up. Each note she played carried fragments of their faith, their hope, their belief in her. She realized that music had always been a collective experience, a way to communicate with others across time and space. And now, in this room of strangers, that truth was manifesting. Her song was not just sound. It was a shared heartbeat, a silent conversation that transcended words. The melody deepened, a low, resonant sequence that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. She felt it in her chest, a physical echo of the emotion she poured into every note. The audience was not merely hearing, they were feeling. She could sense the subtle shifts, hands clenched on laps, subtle tilts of heads, small exhalations that betrayed the impact of the music. She had seen these reactions in small rooms, in modest settings, but never in a place this grand. With an audience so distant and polished, yet here it was, undeniable, real, and breathtaking. Her mind wandered for a moment to her past struggles. She remembered the first time she had truly believed in her ability to communicate through music. It had been in a tiny apartment, in front of a few friends, with worn keys and peeling paint around her. She had been nervous, unsure if anyone would notice, unsure if anyone would care. But when she played, she felt the connection immediately, and it had filled her with a quiet power that she carried ever since. That same connection was alive now, magnified by the size of the room, the presence of strangers, and the intensity of their attention. The song began to shift again, moving into a section that was more complex, more emotionally charged. She let her hands flow with the rhythm, letting the music rise and fall like waves. She played not for perfection, not for display, but for truth. Every note was a piece of herself, a fragment of her journey, a reflection of the years of dedication and struggle that had brought her here. She knew the audience could feel it, could sense the authenticity, even if they did not understand the specifics. They were responding to what was real, what was human, what was undeniable. She noticed a few subtle reactions in the audience that made her heart lift. A man had lowered his glasses and was looking directly at her, a small smile playing on his lips, though he tried to hide it. A woman had reached for her handkerchief, not to wipe tears, but to steady herself against the surge of feeling she could not name. Across the room, a younger man leaned slightly forward, eyes glistening, completely absorbed. These small, almost invisible signals reassured her that the music was reaching beyond the surface, beyond appearances, into something that mattered. She let the song slow now, taking the melody into a gentle, reflective passage. She could feel the emotions in the room deepening, thickening, settling over everyone like a soft blanket. No one moved, no one whispered, no one broke the spell. The silence was not empty. It was full, rich with attention, with feeling, with the shared presence of people experiencing something beyond themselves. She smiled faintly, knowing that this was the moment every performer secretly hopes for. The moment when music speaks louder than words ever could. Her mind wandered again, this time to the broader idea of connection. She thought about how music could cross boundaries, break down walls, and touch hearts in ways nothing else could. Wealth, status, power, these things that seemed so rigid, so impenetrable, had no meaning here. All that mattered was honesty, vulnerability, and the courage to share a piece of one's soul. She felt grateful for the opportunity, for the chance to demonstrate something larger than herself, something that could not be bought or sold. The melody began to rise once more, building in intensity without losing its subtlety. She felt the room responding, not consciously, but instinctively. The audience was leaning in, breathing with her, feeling the music as a living thing. Some eyes shone with unshed tears, some hands twitched with restrained emotion. Some faces softened in recognition of truths they had not expected to confront. She played with care, aware of the immense responsibility she carried. Every note mattered, every pause was deliberate, every breath intentional. Time began to blur. Minutes stretched and folded, and she felt suspended in the moment, completely absorbed in the music and the audience's reaction. She had played for small groups, for classrooms, for community centers, and in each instance, she had felt a connection. But this was different. The size of the room, the prestige of the audience, and the initial skepticism made the connection that much more profound. She realized that emotion was universal, and music was its purest messenger. Here, in this grand hall, she was witnessing it firsthand. She allowed the song to breathe, to flow naturally, letting pauses stretch and notes linger. She could feel the collective heartbeat of the room, subtle and powerful, as it synchronized with her own. There was a quiet magic in this awareness, a realization that music had become a shared experience, a fragile bridge between strangers, between worlds that seemed impossible to connect. And she, for a brief, beautiful moment, was the keeper of that bridge, the guide leading them across as the section drew to a close. She allowed the final notes to linger, delicate and fragile, like drops of light falling into darkness. She could feel the audience's tension, the collective holding of breath, and she let it exist. Without rushing, without pushing for applause, the silence was itself a response, a testament to the impact of what had just unfolded. She smiled softly, not out of pride, but out of quiet satisfaction. She had reached them. She had made them stop. She had made them listen. And that was more than enough. The rich, poised, distant audience had shifted completely. Their walls, carefully constructed over years of privilege and expectation, had begun to crumble, replaced with something far more human: attention, recognition, and emotion. She had not intended to impress, to dazzle, or to show off skill. She had only intended to be honest, and in doing so, she had reached them more deeply than any performance she had given before. And as the room remained still, absorbed in the lingering echoes of the music, she knew the story was far from over. The next section of the song, the true heart of the performance, awaited. And she was ready. The room felt completely transformed now. What had started as polite attention, curiosity, and even doubt had shifted into something heavier, more profound. It was as if the air itself carried a different weight, a quiet gravity that pulled at every person present. She could feel it beneath her fingertips as she rested her hands lightly on the keys, preparing to begin the next part of the song. This was the section she had been waiting for, the one that carried the deepest emotion, the one that told the story she had practiced for weeks. the story she had lived for years. She looked out over the audience, noticing how different they appeared in this new light. Faces that had seemed distant, polished, and cold were now softer, more human. Lines of stress and pride that had held them erect seemed to have melted, if only slightly. Some were leaning forward in their seats, caught in the invisible pull of anticipation. Others had closed their eyes, surrendering fully to the sound, to the emotion, to something they could not name. She felt a quiet thrill knowing that the music had begun to reach them where words could not. Her fingers touched the keys, and the song began again, this time with deliberate intensity. The notes were richer, heavier, carrying a weight she had never attempted in a public performance before. She felt every vibration through her hands, every subtle echo traveling through the room. The melody rose and fell with a life of its own, and she allowed herself to surrender to it completely. She was no longer merely performing. She was speaking without words, telling a story that had been locked. Inside her for years, she could see the first changes in the audience almost immediately. A man in the front row who had been skeptical at first now had his eyes fixed on her hands, his lips parted slightly as if he could not believe what he was hearing. A woman in the second row rested her hand lightly on her chest, her breathing slow and deliberate as though she were holding onto the music for dear life. Across the room, a few people had begun to lean toward each other, exchanging glances that spoke of surprise and recognition. No one had spoken a word, yet the room felt alive with quiet energy. Her mind wandered briefly to her own journey, the years of struggle that had brought her to this moment. She remembered practicing late into the night, hands sore, eyes tired, heart heavy with doubt. She remembered playing for empty rooms, for friends who encouraged her, for strangers who barely noticed. And now, here in this grand hall, filled with people who had everything, her music was touching something raw and undeniable. She realized that the story she was telling through the song was not just hers. It was universal. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt lost, unnoticed, or unheard. The melody grew richer, darker, more complex. She allowed herself to feel the emotion fully, to let it pour through her fingers and into the room. Every note carried struggle, hope, longing, and a quiet strength that had been forged through years of persistence. She played with a deliberate calm, a gentle power that could not be ignored. The audience, once composed and distant, was responding. They were not merely hearing, they were feeling, absorbing. In connecting with the story she was telling, she noticed small gestures, subtle shifts in posture, small exhalations of breath that betrayed the emotions stirring inside the audience. A man tugged lightly at his sleeve as though trying to steady himself. A woman closed her eyes tightly, her lips pressed together as though holding back tears. A younger person in the back leaned forward slightly, clearly captivated, completely engaged. Every subtle response gave her confidence, reminding her that she was not alone in this moment. She had created a space where emotion could be felt freely, and it was working. The song began to reach its heart, the section she had been preparing for, the part that carried the weight of everything she wanted to say. She let her hands flow effortlessly, letting the keys guide her through the emotion she had carried for so long. There was no rush, no forcing, no attempt to impress. Only honesty, only truth, only music speaking as it had always spoken to her. And now, to these strangers who were slowly opening their hearts without even realizing it, she could feel a quiet tension in the room, not one of discomfort, but of anticipation. The audience was leaning in, silently holding their breath, waiting to be moved further. She sensed that something was happening, something rare and delicate. They were no longer just an audience. They were witnesses, participants in the unfolding of a story that transcended wealth, status, or pride. The music had become a bridge, a subtle, powerful connection between her and every person present. Her mind wandered for a moment to the people who had believed in her, those who had supported her when she doubted herself. Their encouragement, their faith, and their quiet belief in her talent were woven into every note she played. She could feel them in her fingers, in her chest, in the way the music seemed to carry a life of its own. She realized that no one truly succeeds alone, and that every moment of validation, no matter how small, had led her to this point. The song began to swell again, rising with a gentle, powerful intensity that filled the room. She allowed the melody to carry the emotion, to ebb and flow naturally, letting it breathe and resonate. She could feel the energy of the audience growing, subtle but undeniable. Some were closing their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others were sitting upright, eyes wide, completely focused. She knew she had their attention fully, not just their polite observation, but their hearts. A few moments passed where she allowed herself to simply feel the music, letting it guide her, letting it tell the story she had carried inside for so long. The richness of the melody, the depth of the emotion, and the honesty in every note created a fragile, almost sacred space in the room. The audience, wealthy and powerful though they were, seemed caught off guard by the depth of feeling. Some had their hands pressed lightly to their chests. Others had their heads tilted back slightly, eyes closed as if trying to absorb every nuance. She could feel the impact, subtle but undeniable, and it filled her with quiet satisfaction. The music began to shift, moving into a section that was both delicate and intense, a contradiction that mirrored life itself. She played with careful precision, letting each note carry the weight of emotion, allowing pauses to linger just long enough for the room to breathe with her. She noticed the audience responding in tiny, almost imperceptible ways. A man in the front had leaned forward slightly as if drawn into the story. A woman in the second row had lifted her hand slightly to steady herself, caught in the quiet power.